But why don't you just clarify what you think about preferred pronouns and why?
Okay. Preferred pronouns, people assume they know what we're talking about. I do take the view that in many or most cases, I will use someone's pronouns. And we can get to the cases that maybe I wouldn't. Let me back up and say, first of all, I believe that biological sex is a binary. There is male and female. Even someone with an intersex condition that's atypical features in one's male or female anatomy. Those two sex categories are not only true, but they are the most basic foundation of what it means to be human. And biblically, I might even say philosophically, but biblically, I believe that biological sex determines whether one is a man or a woman. Like, biological sex is a fundamental part of human identity. God created us, Genesis 1:27, in his own image. And then he says in his Hebrew parallelism, male and female, he created them. So that being male and female, not just being human, not just being embodied, but being specifically sexed-bodied people, that is an essential part of how we bear God's image. The few times, cross-sex identification is addressed in Scripture. It's some more directly, some more indirectly, but whenever it comes up, it is always confronted. It's not part of God's way. So in here, we're 100% in agreement.
I totally agree with that.
And this is where I very much resonate with the concerns that using someone's preferred pronouns, namely the pronoun doesn't match their biological sex, is affirming in them a viewpoint you don't even hold. So why would I use someone's preferred pronouns? For me, a lot of it comes down, there's several reasons. I guess the biggest one would be, it comes down to my view of the flexibility and complexity of language. Language is, if I can illustrate it, it's shared social space between people that might have different viewpoints. The language is that bridge that unites these two people in relationship, and yet the words they're using might reflect different worldviews. So I come up, this is me, and I meet Pam, and I say, "Hi, Pam. I'm Preston. I'm a Christian. Who are you?" And Pam says, "Well, I'm Pam. I'm a trans woman, and my pronouns are she, her." And I said, and I'm thinking like, "But Pam, you're clearly a dude." I'm like, "Well, your pronouns should be he, him because you're a biological male." And Pam says, "Well, yes, many people use pronouns to match their biological sex. My pronouns match my gender identity." What's that? Well, gender identity is my internal sense of who I am. And I'm like, I don't agree with any of that. I don't like that. I don't like gender identity. Well, it's a big deal for me, and the way I use pronouns, it matches my gender identity, not my biological sex. So I have an option here. I can either, in this shared social space, force my worldview and my language that reflects my worldview, which I think is correct. I think objectively it's correct. I could either force that on somebody else and demand that they use language that reflects my worldview, or I can accommodate to their use of language. And this is where I'm going to say I resonate with somebody who says, "No, I'm not going to accommodate. I'm going to use language that only reflects my worldview because I disagree with their worldview." And I'm going to resonate with kind of maybe their concerns there, but I take a position. I think there is some gray here. I think Christians, there are cases when we do accommodate. And so, I'm going to step in and out of an accommodation to where this person is currently at in their journey, I'm going to use the pronouns because they actually do factually match their gender identity. I can disagree whether pronouns should resonate with gender identity. I can disagree with gender identity as a philosophical concept, which I've got many problems with that, and we can tease that out.
We talked about that.
So it's not about agreement or disagreement. So I'm going to accommodate, given the flexibility of language, the complexity of language, a shared social space, not because I agree with what they're saying. Now, if they turned around and said, if Pam, biological male, says, well, do you think I'm a woman? I have to say no. I don't want to give the impression that I am agreeing with all of their ideology and worldview. Now, in a 5-minute conversation at the grocery store, we might not unpack all that. But if a relationship progresses, then I want to make sure I'm not giving the impression that my accommodation is affirmation. So that's where I would agree with you and people who hold your position, that fear of affirming their worldview and reinforcing error. I'm sympathetic to that. So if I sense that in the relationship I am doing that unintentionally or intentionally, then I do want, this is where clarity comes in. I do want to be really clear. I got more, but I would love to.
Okay, so this is helpful. I appreciate the clarity on it. For me, if somebody goes, hey, my name is Pam and here's my gender pronouns, I say, hey, Pam, I'm Sean. Mm-hmm. Like, the most intimate part about somebody is their personal name. Mm-hmm. Now, there's debate about whether names are gendered or not, whether we should use them. I'm less concerned with names because there is a flexibility built in to make your point about linguistic flexibility. Mm-hmm. I was in high school and we were talking about sports last night. You're a baseball guy. I'm a basketball guy. And I remember this 6'8" African-American guy, stud basketball player, older than I was. And he told me his name was Stephanie. And I didn't think, oh, he's a girl. I thought, well, okay, maybe this name has more flexibility. So names do seem to have some linguistic flexibility. But he and she is built into our language, reflecting a biological reality. Mm. That's why some languages are actually gendered by their very nature. Why? Because they reflect not just a relativism of language, but something built into the fabric of our bodies and the universe that we know comes from a creator. Mm-hmm. So I agree with linguistic flexibility to a degree, but I'm concerned when it goes, and it seems to me, if I'm willing to say, well, somebody identifies as a woman, even though they're biologically male, because we have this concept of gender, some people may use it that way. Mm-hmm. But then that seems to also buy into the idea that gender can be separated from biological sex. Mm-hmm. So if I'm able to say, like, the one concern is that if I say he to a she, I'm lying. Mm-hmm. One way around that is, I think if I heard you correctly, is to say gender is what is meant by she. Mm-hmm. So if I say she, I'm not really lying because that's how that person understands himself. Mm-hmm. So you get potentially out of the lie objection, but then now adopted with that is an acceptance of language that gendered is not necessarily connected to biology, which I think is hugely problematic from within a Christian worldview. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I there's a lot there. The gender piece, maybe we come back to that. I actually think you're being inconsistent with the name thing.
Okay, tell me why.
Because while names are socially constructed and aren't intrinsically connected to, like, they're not universally necessarily always connected to a certain sex. In this case, Pam, assuming they had a male typical name before, has chosen Pam specifically because they believe they are a woman in terms of gender. So while... And your basketball friend Stephanie is not identifying as a woman, so there's no cross-sex connection to this name. But for Pam, it's one of the most fundamental parts of her transitioning is a name that is female typical. So in that moment, by affirming that, or Caitlyn Jenner, why does Bruce call himself Caitlyn now? Because he says he's a woman now, and Caitlyn is a female typical name. Now, if somebody else is named Caitlyn that doesn't identify as a woman, but they're male and they have, kind of like your friend Stephanie, I think that's a different scenario.
So this is interesting, and I've thought about the point about it being inconsistent, and maybe I should go further and not use names at all to keep my point in line. Maybe if I'm inconsistent, it just means I need to be more consistent and not even use it. It doesn't mean that my argument itself doesn't stand. Now, in the case of Pam, I don't know who this person is. I don't know the backstory. The scenario was you literally just meet somebody. Yeah. That's different than somebody who I knew was Steve, and then they shift to Pam. That's a different scenario. Do I use it in that case?
Yeah.
I don't know. It depends on my relationship
But
with that person.
if you knew
the
clearly
name.
this is a male, yeah, I understand if they're like passing as female. You know, like I have a friend who's transitioned male to female, and you would never know it. In fact, they hung out with us for a while, and after they left,
Then you knew.
well, I already knew, but my wife didn't, and I told her like,
That's interesting.
So you know, so and so was biologically male, and she flipped it. She's like, what? You know, but anyway, we're getting a little lost in the weeds here. But I would say if you believe you should not affirm any kind of social self-affirmation that this person identifies as a gender different than their biological sex, whether it's names or pronouns, and I would think you would need to be consistently refuse to accommodate to those social indicators, whatever it might be.
So maybe. I guess one difference I would say is that there is a flexibility with names that change, and we know this over time. I met a girl that's named Sean. I know guys who are named Stacy and Kelly, but he and she is not the kind of thing for which there is linguistic flexibility at all. I think there's a difference there.
Neither you and I are experts in linguistics per se, but I would say, if you want to think broadly, terms do change over time. Back in Chaucer's, I use this illustration, when's Chaucer writing? 15th century? I don't know.
You're asking the wrong person.
But back then, apparently in older English, little girls just meant little kids. Like it was boys and girls, and they were called girls. Even now, some really persnickety linguists would say, well, given the fact that a growing number of people use pronouns to refer to gender identity, language rules shift. They follow movements of culture. Just like the word gay used to be happy, and now it means same-sex attracted, or there's many other examples we can give.
That's true.
And they would say we're in the middle right now, like it or not, that there's a growing consensus that pronouns are more flexible. And even, I think the Oxford English Dictionary adopted they, them as a valid way to define somebody who's non-binary or something. I don't quote, there's something like that. And that, a lot of people got upset. Well, the dictionary shouldn't do that. And maybe it shouldn't, but that's just kind of like language does morph and shift with usage. And then the dictionaries kind of follow behind and start to flex with that usage. So, but I agree. I agree that he, she in the English language in Western countries right now predominantly refers to biological sex.